AP European History students, today we are going to cover part two of topic 1.2, the Italian Renaissance. Just a reminder, our theme for this topic is cultural and intellectual development. Yesterday we worked our way through objective A, explain the context in which the Renaissance and Age of Discovery developed. Today we're going to be digging a bit deeper into objective B, which is explain how the revival of classical texts contributed to the development of the Renaissance in Italy. And we're also going to cover Objective C, which is explain the political, intellectual, and cultural effects of the Italian Renaissance. If you remember yesterday, we learned about some of the basics of the Renaissance and how it was the rebirth of Greco-Roman civilization in the Western world. We learned the birthplace took place in Florence, Italy, and that the Renaissance is kind of that transition from the Dark Ages, linking us to the modern world. We talked about how one of the biggest cultural themes of the Renaissance was the idea of people starting to live secular, especially after the bubonic plague. We looked at the economics of the Italian city-states and their competition with the Hanseatic League to the north in the Baltic Sea. We identified the Medici family as being the ones responsible for this economic rebirth with their advancements in textiles, banking, and eventually politics. We were looking at probably more so through the lens of what the social structure of Europe was in general, with the first, second, and third estates. We looked at some of the key publishings of the early Renaissance, such as Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. We looked at the structure of Renaissance families, and we also looked at what Italy was looking like politically at the birth of the Renaissance, with its 5 major states. Today we're going to pick up where we left off after discussing who was in political control of each state and how the various countries of Europe were getting involved in Italian politics. But we left off with this man, Niccolo Machiavelli, and his publishing of The Prince. Machiavelli is one of the most important figures of this entire class. His concept of the prince is going to reappear as we analyze the various governments as we progress through the history of Europe. So in looking at Niccolo Machiavelli, we want to know that he was the author of one of the most famous treatises on political power in the Western world. Machiavelli had a unique background. He was a Florentine statesman who served time advising the leaders of Florence. He served as an ambassador to other states. He had spent time in France at the French royal court as well as other Germanic princes' courts, and he had a unique perspective on government in general. We need to remember that Machiavelli and his publishing of The Prince would change politics forever. And his treatise really dealt with the acquisition and expansion of political power. The title itself, The Prince, tells us who this was a guidebook for. Princes, aristocrats, or anybody in power. Machiavelli would give us one of those classical questions when it comes to leaders in power. Is it better to be feared, or is it better to be loved? And Machiavelli would tell us that sometimes you need to be feared, sometimes you need to be loved, but above all, sometimes you need to be ruthless in maintaining power. We know that Machiavelli would challenge the belief of leaders abiding by Christian moral principles. Up until this point in history, most of the kings and aristocrats who ruled over regions of Europe had a sense of belonging to the single Christendom that had developed and filled the void after the collapse of Rome. And many of these leaders felt that their image and their style of power had to abide by Christian morals. Machiavelli would be the first to challenge that concept, telling political leaders that sometimes they might have to leave the realms of Christian morality in ruthlessness or brutality to maintain power and authority over their lands. He believed in general men were ungrateful, dishonest, and greedy when given the opportunity, so monarchs need to be ruthless in dealing with those types of human characteristics. We definitely see the impact of Machiavelli from his contemporary rulers that read his work all the way up into the 20th and 21st centuries. We can probably even reference some of the world leaders that have been unbelievably brutal and ruthless, especially in the treatment of their peoples, in an effort to maintain power. When I ask students, can you rattle off some 20th century leaders, dictators that used unbelievable brutality and definitely were not ruling in the confines of Christian morals? A lot of times people reference Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany, or even Mao Zedong of China. Right? So along with Bal de Castellion's Courtier, a guidebook on how to be a gentleman or a Renaissance man and woman, Niccolo Machiavelli is the other of the most predominant authors of the Italian Renaissance. When we look at the cultural changes that were brought about by the Italian Renaissance, along with living secular, or people focusing on the here and the now, and focusing less on the spiritual or getting to heaven, focusing more on their earthly desires, there are three other vocab words that we need to take into account. The first one is individualism, or an emphasis on an interest in the unique traits of each person. This definitely would come about during the Renaissance and was far different from the way that people lived during the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, the importance and the celebration of the individual was really put on the back burner, and more of an emphasis on the spiritual and the community of, the community of Christians that lived where the Bible taught them to live meek and poor in hopes to get to heaven. Many people looked to their priests and their cardinals and their bishops for direction, and there wasn't so much a celebration of individual talents as there was a lack of humanism, right? Which is our second word that we focused on, humanism. Humanism is an emphasis on human achievement. Those human achievements might include reading, writing, art, rhetoric, involvement in politics. Humanism was essentially lost during the Dark Ages, and a big component of the Renaissance was a rediscovery of art and learning and reading and writing. Another cultural vocab word that we should know with the Renaissance is naturalism. Many of the great thinkers and artists of the Renaissance returned to this classical style of naturalism, of placing man back into his place with nature. We'll see naturalism as we look at the artworks of the great Italian Renaissance artists. We'll see naturalism in the backgrounds of the great paintings. We will see mankind portrayed in the nude in his natural setting. We know that naturalism, as well as realism and using a perspective in artwork, will give us some of the most glorious pieces of what we would say the beginnings of modern art that the world has ever seen. So whenever you're asked to explain the cultural changes that were brought about by the Renaissance, think of individualism, secularism, humanism, and naturalism. Now, some of the illustrative examples of the people that actually rediscovered the classics or the works of Greco-Roman intellectuals are very important to us. Being able to come up with an example, an illustrative example, gives us evidence that this was actually taking place in Renaissance Italy. And the first person we need to discuss is an Italian named Petrarch, who lived from 1304 to 1374. He is considered by most the father of the Renaissance. Petrarch was a great intellectual. He was a great poet, and he was most renowned for compiling the largest collection of Greco-Roman works coming out of the Dark Ages. Petrarch would spend much of his time translating works from Latin into people's vernacular or their native tongue. Another Renaissance humanist that we should know is a man named Leonardo Bruni, who lived from 1370 to 1444. A resident of Florence, he rose to the title of chancellor, and he was focused on one of the Greco-Roman classics of Cicero, a great statesman in the Roman Empire. Leonardo Bruni would author a book called The New Cicero, in which he would study the philosophy and the life works of that great Roman statesman. And Leonardo Bruni would take from that study the concept of civic humanism. The study of the humanities should be put to the service of the state. So not only were these great Renaissance intellectuals becoming literate in the Latin and Greek classics, but they were digesting this message from the past, and they were promoting people to become individuals, become educated for the hopes of using that education to help further their specific Italian city-state. The next humanist is Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla is known for conducting a deep study of the Latin language. He lived from 1407 to 1457. His goal was to purify medieval Latin and restore Latin to its proper position over the vernacular. Lorenzo Valla had a talent of being able to distinguish between Latin coming out of the ancient world of Rome and the kind of, we'd probably say, perverted Latin that came about in the early Dark Ages that was not as polished. And he could differentiate between the classical works and the works that came after the classical period. And in doing that, he wanted to return the entire Latin language to its former glory. The fourth humanist of the Renaissance that we should be familiar with is Marsilio Ficino, who lived from 1433 to 1499. Unlike the other humanists who were studying the works of Cicero, Ficino was studying the work of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and he started to apply much of Plato's philosophy to his contemporary Renaissance Italy. His concept of Neoplatonic thought was a theory of Neoplatonic hierarchy, which places the lowest forms of matter, such as plants, all the way up to the purest form of matter, which is God. And he thought that humans occupied a middle position. And he thought that a big goal of these individuals and these humanists should be to become as educated as they possibly can and make their way farther up that social scale, right, closer to the gods by becoming more educated. The fifth Renaissance humanist is Giovanni Pica della Mirandola, who lived from 1436 to 1494. He was a humanist who authored a famous work called The Oration of the Dignity of Man, in which he told his readers truths can be found in science, which is a part of God's revelation to humanity. So, for the first time, people are starting to think that we should become educated. God has given us these gifts to educate ourselves as individuals to reach our highest potential. And because God has given us these potentials to become educated, we should take advantage of them. So you can kind of see how the works of Mirandola and Ficino could be adapted to people wanting to become more educated as individuals, to becoming better citizens of these Italian city-states, using that education to service the state. We know that there was also a rediscovery of the classical study of history, which we know was born of the Greeks and perfected by the Romans. Renaissance historians like to divide their history into the ancient world, the Dark Ages, and then their own age. hence the word the Renaissance meaning a rebirth. Leonardo Bruni, who we just discussed, actually authored The History of the Florentine People, where he liked to de-emphasize divine intervention in favor of human motives, which was a big step for people coming out of the Dark Ages who lived in a very religious community in a religious world, rejecting divine intervention and focusing on the narrative of human beings shaping human narratives. The last of our humanists is Francesco Guicciardini, who lived from 1483 to 1540. He wrote a history of the Italian peninsula, represented modern analytical history, emphasizing political and military history, which is a big step. A big job of historians is to be objective, not to write about opinion or hearsay, but actually making history a science, using analytical reasoning, talking to primary sources, and in his case, focusing on political and military history is something that would become the mainstay for most historians throughout the Western world. The political state and the actions of their militaries being the primary focus of historical narratives. So when we look at all of these great Renaissance Italian humanists, remember they all wanted to focus on a rediscovery of the classics, the Greeks and the Romans. They were all individuals that were promoting people to reach their highest potential. Many of them were secular, basing their works free of religion, and all of them, as we said, were humanists, part of that movement to rediscover human achievements like reading, writing, and the arts. In this case, the literary arts. But now let's take a look at those humanists that you're probably most familiar with, the ones that gave us the beauty of Renaissance artwork. It's kind of fun to look at Renaissance art. Many of us can now lean on our childhood knowledge of the Ninja Turtles, right? Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael, and actually learn where those Ninja Turtles got their names. But before we look at their artwork and their stories, let's take into consideration how artwork in the Renaissance differed from that came before it in the Middle Ages. When we were learning about the High Middle Ages, you read about an artist named Giotto, who started us off on this track. And beginning with Giotto, we start to see the emergence of perspective, realism, and naturalism. Part of this had to do with innovations in paint, as people started to develop oil-based paints that could be layered. Their understanding of geometry, as well as their curiosity in learning about the human anatomy, also would help aid a huge change in the artistic product that was being put out. So when we look at these works, let's look for perspective. 3 dimensions on a flat surface with the artist utilizing geometry. Let's also look at realism, an artist's use of light and shadows, having an understanding of how light changes the dimension of figures. And let's look at naturalism. Artists considered imitation of nature their primary goal. A 4th characteristic would be most Renaissance art also had a golden hue, right? Most of the skin color of the objects being portrayed almost illuminates with a golden hue, like there's a light shining on it from somewhere, from Never Never Land. Although most of the Renaissance art is biblical in nature or depicts scenes coming out of the Bible, we will see that not all Renaissance art was biblical in nature. So let's take a look at some of these famous works of art. Chronologically, the first artist that we want to look at is Donato di Donatello, who lived from 1386 to 1466. He was the sculptor of the original statue of David. And that statue of David sat in the courtyard of Cosimo de' Medici, one of the famous architects and patrons of the Renaissance arts in Florence, Italy. And this statue that you're looking at to the right celebrates the Florentine victory over Milan in 1428. if you look at this piece, you can see its naturalism as it was done in the nude. You can see that it's biblical in nature, as David was about to slay the Goliath in one of the Old Testament biblical tales. We also see that a person must have knowledge in the human anatomy, a resting pose, muscle structures, and all sorts of background in things outside of the arts to construct a piece like this. The second artist from the earlier Italian Renaissance was Filippo Brunelleschi, who lived from 1377 to 1446. He was an architect, and he is known for building a dome for the unfinished Cathedral of Florence, also known as the Duomo, which is located at the Church of San Lorenzo. He constructed the classical columns and the arches, but is most known for constructing that magnificent dome, a piece of architectural splendor that has not been seen since the Pantheon of ancient Rome. Here's a picture of the exterior of the Duomo, a magnificent cathedral of San Lorenzo in Florence, Italy. You can see how it towers above the Italian landscapes in the background. If you were to enter this cathedral and walk up its interior, you would see its Gothic design, but after you get through the Gothic design, you then hit the dome, the Duomo itself. And you look up into the dome, it's a spiraling staircase of pictorial with biblical tales. And if you can imagine seeing this for the first time after hundreds of years of people losing the ability to create art like this, you would probably be in awe. The Duomo, in most history textbooks in Florence, represents that birthplace, right? That rebirth of art that we associate with the time period. And now on to the giants of art coming out of the Italian Renaissance, beginning with Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1475 to 1519. Da Vinci was an artist who idealized the concept of the Renaissance man. He is most known for creating the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, but he's also known as being one of those people in history that stands out as being a true game changer in acculturizing an entire people. He's the quintessential example of a Renaissance man. He could paint, he could sculpt, he could sketch, he could swing a sword. He was drawing sketches of military machines 500 years before they would be invented. He studied the aerodynamics of birds, he studied the anatomy of human beings, and he was a master of mathematics. He was a bit paranoid that possibly the central authority of the day, the Catholic Church, might find his ideas and sketchings too radical. So he chose to write his notes in a dialect that you could only read by putting his notebooks up to a mirror. Let's take a look at some of Da Vinci's work. On the left, you have the Mona Lisa. The word Mona means Madame, so this is Madame Lisa, a portrait of an aristocratic woman. Leonardo da Vinci, in this work, you can see, has mastered realism, the use of light and shadows. You see a subtle shadow underneath her chin, or perhaps the subtle shadow around her eyes. You see in the background the use of perspective, an uneven landscape, but it gives the piece a three-dimensional dimension. We also see naturalism, a landscape of the natural world behind the Mona Lisa. You look at her and you wonder what she's thinking, if she's curious. It's almost as if her heart is beating. Leonardo da Vinci was able to take his knowledge and to create a visual pictorial of human emotion that really had not been seen ever in history. And that's probably why the Mona Lisa, which is housed at the Louvre today in Paris, France, is the most famous painting in the world. The picture on the right is a biblical depiction of the Madonna and Jesus and John and the baby goldfinch. Another way to look at this is, once again, the use of light and shadows, the naturalism in the background. Both pictures show a golden hue, or the objects of the paintings are illuminated. Realism, perspective, golden hue, and sometimes biblical themes can give us a clear indicator of it being a Renaissance piece. One of Leonardo's most famous works, obviously, is The Last Supper. And I chose kind of a digital recreation here so we can really look at its magnificence. Obviously, The Last Supper is a painting of Jesus, as he's just told his disciples that one of them is going to betray him. You can notice here that Leonardo used geometry, that all aspects are pointing back to the right eye of Christ. And he's using geometry to bring perspective into the painting as the corridor gets smaller behind the disciples and Jesus, and then once again with a natural landscape in the background. The table, the food, the figures, the background gives this painting a sense of dimension or perspective. But more so than anything, Leonardo captures the mood, the emotions of the people. Imagine being told that one of the disciples is going to betray the Son of God, the natural reaction that would come about from people, maybe the anger, maybe the confusion, the curiosity, the awe. Leonardo captured the emotions of the disciples so soundly, and that is why he is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, artist in the world. And then there's the contemporary of Leonardo, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo lived from 1475 to 1564. He is known as being an artist, a sculptor, an architect. He is most known for his work that he had done for Pope Julius II in his painting of the Sistine Chapel. He's also known for the second statue of David, a colossal statue that stood 14 feet high. It was the largest sculpture in Italy since the time of Rome. His third most famous piece is probably the Pietà, the depiction of the lifeless body of Christ laying in the lap of Mary after being pulled down from the cross, which we'll take a look at. And he's also known in his role as an architect, as he was the one commissioned to construct the dome over the most magnificent building in the world, St. Peter's Basilica. Let's take a look at some of Michelangelo's work. There on the left, you see the 14-foot statue of David. It's originally put on display outside in Florence, Italy. Today it is housed inside. But you can see the magnificence of Michelangelo's artistry, taking a 14-foot block of marble that nobody had touched for years and constructing an adolescent boy. The features of it are outstanding. David, who slew Goliath, was a teenager. Look how big David's hands and how big his feet are, just like a teenage boy's body would be. A teenager has not grown into his adult body, right? But David has a fierce look on his face. Michelangelo put a determined emotion into him. And then, of course, David is in the nude, which brings us back to that element of naturalism that Renaissance artists were so keen to. His second most famous statue is the Pietà, which also sits in St. Peter's Basilica. As we said, it was the lifeless body of Christ laying in the lap of Mary. Think about the understanding of the human anatomy that you would have to have, or how a lifeless body would be positioned or posed. People were surprised at how young Mary looked, how young the Madonna looked in his sculpture, and he said that he made her look very young because of the purity of her soul. Pietà is one of the most famous sculptures in all of the world and has been recreated countless times in celebration of the Catholic faith. Pope Julius II, as we learned, commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which sits adjacent to St. Peter's Basilica. For 4 years, Michelangelo lay on his back, painting into wet plaster from a scaffold, a gigantic biblical pictorial that's been unmatched by anybody in the history of the world. The back wall recreates the scenes of Judgment Day, and the various scenes from the Sistine Chapel show us scenes from Italian history and biblical history, but the most famous one being on the right here, which is God touching the hand of Adam, who's sitting in the Garden of Eden. But once again, we can see realism, the use of light and shadows, perspective, especially in some of these side panels, and naturalism as we see Adam in the nude. One of the biggest things with Renaissance artists is they were trying to recreate the artistic techniques of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So you see a lot of human perfection, a lot of muscles, right? A lot of perfect bodies. You probably wouldn't see Homer Simpson with his beer gut hanging over his belt in any one of these classical pieces. And then there is Michelangelo's work as an architect. He was the one that was commissioned to create the Great Dome over over St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo went to Rome to study the Pantheon to see how the ancient Romans had constructed that dome, which spanned 180 feet. He returned to the Vatican and created the most spectacular dome in the history of the world. We know it's the most spectacular dome in the history of the world because almost every major country across the planet would try to recreate that Greco-Roman dome in their state capitals and nations' capitals, including our own in Washington, D.C. The picture on the right shows you what the dome looks like from the interior in St. Peter's Basilica. Absolutely stunning. The last of our 3 Renaissance artists is Raphael Sanzio. He was the youngest of the 3 artists. He lived from 1483 to 1520. He's regarded as one of Italy's best painters, most known for his frescoes that decorate the Vatican Palace and the Vatican Museum, the most famous of which is the School of Athens, as well as the work Transfiguration. He is known as the master of realism. If we look at some of Raphael's work, we can see his brilliance. Here you have on the left the School of Athens. And I love this work because it shows us realism, the use of light and shadows. It shows us perspective and his knowledge of geometry to give the picture depth. But it also shows us who these Renaissance Italians were looking to for inspiration. They were humanists. They were looking back to the Greco-Roman classics. And in this painting, this fresco, I should say, he's paying homage to the ancient Greeks. You see the philosophers Socrates and Plato walking down the corridor, the great Greek map maker Ptolemy with his globes. You see Pythagoras over here postulating his Pythagorean theorem. Truly a remarkable fresco that sits in the Vatican Museum today. One work that sits in St. Peter's Basilica is the work on the right called Transfiguration, or Jesus' ascension up into heaven. If you look at the cloth of Jesus in all white, representing his purity, you can see the use of light and shadows and how Raphael could truly be called the master of realism. The emotions, as we see a young boy seizing in the crowd, capturing the emotions of the crowd, but the divine nature of Jesus' ascension is truly captured here. Raphael truly was, as we said, a master of realism. So as we look back at the half dozen literary artists and the four visual artists, we want to remind ourselves of the overall theme of the Renaissance. These Renaissance artists, in difference to the ones that would come after them, tried to depict their subjects exactly how they looked in reality, geometrically perfect, just as the Greeks and the Romans did. We will see artists deviate from that in the 1500s with the emergence of Mannerism, or even as we get farther down into the line of the 1700s or Rococo or 1800s with Impressionism and abstract art that comes about later on. But in this case, this was a neoclassical work. Artists trying to depict their subjects mathematically perfect, an exact replica of what they looked like in reality. So our key concepts here today, after looking at those writers and artists, is that the Renaissance was a revival of Greek and Roman texts that led to new methods of scholarship and new values in society and religion. Humanistic revivals of classical texts furthered values of secularism and individualism, challenged institutional powers of universities and the Catholic Church as people started to shy away from scholasticism, or education through the lens of theology, and started to become educated in secular topics. And we also see a supported civic humanism, ultimately bringing about secular models of political behavior, as we obviously saw with Machiavelli's publishing of The Prince.